Good evening. I do hope my story didn't keep you awake last night. Here is another. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. With houses, it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof that makes the gooseflesh come and the hair rise. Something of the original passion of the evildoer, and of the horror felt by his victim, enters the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a weekend visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house at the other end of the town, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. "I've got the keys," she announced. "Got them until Monday." "The keys of the bathing machine?" he asked innocently. "The keys of the haunted house in the square, and I'm going there tonight." "But you can't go alone," he began. "That's why I wired for you." "Oh, thanks, Aunt Julia," he said politely. "Thanks awfully. Is anything likely to happen?" "A great deal has happened," she whispered. 3 tenants have come and gone in the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now. The story dates a long way back. It's to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. One night, he managed to secrete himself in the cellar, and when everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and threw bodily over the banisters into the hall below. And the stableman was caught, I believe, and hanged for murder. But it all happened a century ago, and I've not been able to get more details of the story." Slowly, they walked along the empty streets of the town until they stopped before a tall, narrow house that rose before them into the night, ugly in shape and painted a dingy white. Shutterless windows without blinds stared down upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. The first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the key before he could fit it into the lock. At last, the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. They passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through empty halls and passages. Instantly, with the echoes, another sound made itself heard, and Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backwards to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close beside him, so close that it seemed they must have been actually by his side in the darkness. Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound, but it met nothing more solid than air. Oh, get a light quick," she whispered. The sound, however, was not repeated, and in another minute they had a candle burning. Shorthouse peered up into the well of darkness and thought of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house. "Aunt Julia," he said, "we must now go through the house from top to bottom and make a thorough search. You feel quite sure of yourself? It's not too late?" "I think so," she whispered. "You understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once, for to hesitate means to admit fear. That is fatal." "Agreed," she said. Arm in arm, Shorthouse holding the dripping candle, they began a systematic search. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. They next went towards the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream, which she instantly tried to stifle by placing her hand over her mouth. Facing them, directly in their way between the doorposts, stood the figure of a woman. She had dishevelled hair and wildly staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. She stood there motionless for the space of a single second. Then the candle flickered, and she was gone "Only the beastly jumping candlelight," he said quickly in a voice that sounded like someone else's. "Come on, Aunt, there's nothing there. Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait up in." He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness, they went on, but over his body the skin moved as if crawling ants covered it. Cautiously they began to go up into the dark vault of the upper house. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen, looking into each other's eyes with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame. From the room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors quietly closing. "It's beginning," whispered a voice at his elbow, which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded acquiescence, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a moment or two to balance it safely against the wall. Suddenly, there came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle was out. But to Shorthouse himself had come more than this. For, as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward, so close to his own that he could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark, with thick features and angry, savage eyes. It was evil in its ordinary, normal expression, no doubt, but as he saw it, alive with intense, aggressive emotion, it was a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of the air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet, stockinged or muffled feet, the apparition of the face and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorthouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung on to him. With as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor. It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the 3rd floor, close to the top of the stairs, and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was said to be the room into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. There was something in the air of this room. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was for himself the chief horror of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor, leaving the door a few inches ajar, so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes and no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait, with their backs against the wall. One by one, the clocks of the town struck midnight. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning very faintly to make themselves audible. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. The sounds were upstairs, somewhere among those horrid, gloomy little servants' rooms with their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings and cramped windows, upstairs where the victim had first been disturbed and stalked to her death. It was the sound of feet moving stealthily along the passage overhead. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him. An extraordinary something had come into her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It smoothed out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere a little tighter. It brought into the face, with the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost of childhood. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror, which could wipe a human countenance clean of other emotions, obliterating all previous expressions. But he had never realized that it could be literally true, or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he now saw. The dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in that utter vacancy of the face beside him. Inaction was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself, and desperate, aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Upstairs, the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and closer, accompanied by occasional creaking of the boards. Shorthouse then quietly got on his feet, saying in a determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is about. You must come too. It's what we agreed." They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes the deep black space over the banisters. Then they began to mount the narrow staircase. About halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled, and Shorthouse turned to catch her by the arm, and just at that moment there came a terrific crash in the servants' corridor overhead. It was instantly followed by a shrill, agonized scream that was a cry of terror and a cry for help melted into one. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly, 3 steps at a time, down the very staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to shake. Shorthouse and his companion just had time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying steps was upon them, and 2 persons, with the slightest possible interval between them, dashed past at full speed. The 2 runners, pursuer and pursued, had passed clean through them where they stood. Yet they had seen absolutely nothing. There came a second's pause. Then the first one, the lighter of the 2, obviously the pursued one, ran with uncertain footsteps into the little room which Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed. There was a sound of scuffling, gasping, and smothered screaming, and then out onto the landing came the step of a single person treading weightily. A dead silence followed, for the space of half a minute, and then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull, crashing thud in the depths of the house below, on the stone floor of the hall. Aunt Julia began fumbling her way downstairs, and Shorthouse put his arm around her and half carried her. Arm in arm, walking very slowly without once looking behind them, they marched down the 3 flights into the hall. The whole way down the stairs, they were conscious that someone followed them step by step. When they went faster, it was left behind, and when they went more slowly, it caught them up. But never once did they look behind to see, and at each turning of the staircase they lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands, Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of the cool night air, blowing in from the sea. And now I must leave you, but I will be back tomorrow. Sleep well.